What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. The buff to Shadow King had the explicit reasoning of attempting to balance out Agent Venom as a very powerful card in the metagame. I regret to inform you that, fairly predictably in my opinion, this has failed, at least at the top end. Agent Venom is still a very much metagame defining card. I can't speak to how it is everywhere, but I can say that there is a lot of Agent Venom. There is also a lot of other stuff, but what I think it mostly did was swing the pendulum a little bit among Agent Venom decks from the one that didn't run Shadow King, i.e. AV Iron Man, towards decks like Bounce and Sera that are able to take advantage of Shadow King after the buff. Unfortunately, those are still Agent Venom decks, and I guess it kind of could only go one of two ways, right? Either the Agent Venom deck that played Cosmo to beat Shadow King got better, or the Agent Venom decks that played Shadow King got better. There wasn't really a world, in my opinion, where Agent Venom was meaningfully negatively affected at the top level of play by the Shadow King buff. Unfortunately, that is the world that we live in, and so we still have to talk about what I would consider patient zero for the metagame. Longtime viewers will know that is often where I start. That doesn't mean this is the best deck in the game, but what it does mean is that this is the deck from which other deck building decisions are made, and that this is the deck that informs the metagame the most. This is, of course, Agent Venom Bounce, and this is a reasonable expectation to want to try to beat when you queue up Marvel Snap, because the new card just came out. It's called Toxin, and it's very good in Bounce, and it's only good in Bounce. And so that means that there are a lot of people, not just the people who are playing this deck because it's very good, because it has Shadow King, but also people who are playing their new awesome card that they just got, and it only really goes in here. That's why this deck is sort of the tone setter for this metagame. It's unclear whether this deck is necessarily good enough to deserve its play rate, but it is one of the most played decks in the game, and more importantly, it has a very unique points-based dynamic that makes not accounting for it very difficult when you run up against it. This is a deck that, as weird as it may sound, sort of fills the hella role of just points checking you. If you don't have enough points to beat Bounce, you just lose these matchups all the time. And the numbers this deck can put out on the board are very, very large. There is some debate about the specifics of Agent Venom Bounce right now. I've seen lists cut Shadow King for extra one-drops. Iceman and Spider-Ham are typically popular inclusions if you can get them in. For the record, if you're missing any of the one-drops from Series 4 and 5, feel free to replace them with Iceman and Spider-Ham. They're not that much worse. And of course, you have this new strategy attached to it, where the other thing you're going to really want to be flexing about is Bishop versus Sage versus Werewolf by Night. That is typically the way that it works. You can also try to flex in Mysterio. What I'm basically saying is Shadow King Bishop tend to be flex slots in these decks. Right or wrong, those are the cards that people are actually swapping in and out for other cards, and you can feel comfortable making those decisions on your own as well, depending on what you're actually trying to do. One note on Werewolf by Night, I have actively not enjoyed it because a lot of these games are about throwing priority, and Werewolf does make that a decent bit harder. Sage is really interesting because you are able to do these Sage, Hitmonkey, Black Swan, a million one-drops final turns, and she ends up being quite strong when you do that, but also she's hard to get out when you're not doing that because you don't have enough energy to play Sage Hitmonkey unless you are Black Swanning. So there's this sort of conflict between a card you want that is good with Black Swan, Sage, and a card that scales up earlier by putting it on the board like Bishop and Werewolf. Agent Venom's Sera is a powerful, powerful deck right now. I would say that it's one of, if not the best deck in the game. Sort of a very expected deck at this point. Like, I've had multiple people read my snaps, know exactly what they mean, and play well to counter it. But this is a deck that has a lot of power in it, a lot of ability to distribute that power in ways that are confusing, and a lot of relevant tech cards for the current metagame. It is uniquely good against bounce decks because of Invisible Woman and Killmonger alongside Invisible Woman and Shadow King. Makes the bounce matchup very, very difficult to actually lose. It is a powerhouse in a variety of situations as well, especially if you're able to get your Agent Venom onto your Mysterio, One thing that I think goes a little bit understated with this list is that Agent Venom is not as good in this deck as he is in other decks, unless you are hitting Mysterio, in which case not only does he become just a bit smaller than Dr. Doom, he also starts carrying Gwenpool buffs as well. So you can do things like Agent Venom, draw Mysterio, Gwenpool put stuff onto that Mysterio, suddenly Mysterio is like 8 power in every lane. And that kind of power play is not necessarily impossible for other decks to beat, but it's extremely, extremely difficult because it's usually paired with some other ridiculous thing on the final turn of the game. It's very hard for someone to beat 8 power Mysterio in every lane and relevant tech. That's just not a realistic thing that these decks can actually beat. And much like every other time Sera ends up good, it is because of the power that you can bring to bear. The tech is all awesome and cool, but the thing that's allowing the tech to succeed right now is the fact that you get to skimp on power because your Mysterio is so big, because your Hitmonkey is so big, because your US Agent is so relevant, because your Killmonger is so relevant. This is kind of what Sera Tech has to look like right now because of the way the metagame is oriented. The one card you're going to be the most scared of is Cosmo. That is a dangerous card for you. But again, we talk about this Agent Venom Mysterio thing. If you are Agent Venom Mysterioing, you don't have to worry about Cosmo. You're playing Dr. Doom and they're playing a 3/3. And that's the other reason why this deck manages to succeed, even as other Sera decks that are more reliant on actual on-reveals happening are able to sort of fall by the wayside. Having access to that Mysterio play is so good for beating the stuff that beats you. And that's how you get 8 cubes. I've actually been fairly impressed with the Scream deck. It has a nominally pretty bad matchup into Bounce, but I think you just sort of have to understand that and mitigate that in the way you approach the situation. Bounce decks, when they're going off, are gonna outpower you. It's not like you're gonna realistically beat an Agent Venom on turn 2 and then any cards they have. It's just not realistic for you a lot of the time. The one thing you have going for you against Bounce decks is a truly massive amount of scams. You have the ability to mess up their bounce preparations by moving their stuff around and getting him out of beast lanes. For that reason, Falcon is actually probably their best bouncer against you by a wide margin because it doesn't care about what lanes that it's in. In addition, you have these final turn scams. You have Juggernaut, you have Cannonball. There's a bunch of crazy stuff you can do, and you really need to be scamming with this deck to keep up. With the loss of the Storm combo here, this deck has actually not taken nearly as much of a hit as you might think. And a lot of that is because every card that was a Storm combo card has now been replaced with another card that scams. We're scamming as hard as actually possible here. Our job is to just get them. But, and this is important, we actually have a functional mid-range deck as the backup. This is the kind of deck that can do fairly well into those Sera decks when they're not AV Mysterioing you, because you can make their game plans very awkward. You can use locations to your advantage. You can clog them up a little bit, which they don't really like. And that allows you to be a competent mid-range deck with a limited weakness to what people are really teching about right now. The most common tech cards we see are things like Killmonger and Shadow King, which are not awful against you, but they're nowhere near as good against you as they are against things like Bounce or the other Agent Venom decks. And so you get to have this not necessarily unmolested type of way through the metagame, but you do get to have mostly a free ride because people aren't that worried about this deck, because they feel like they're just going to outpower it a decent amount of the time. And that's not an incorrect feeling to have. Like, this is not a deck that wants to see turn 2 Agent Venoms or is happy about that. This is a deck that really wants to have its own turn 2 Scream. But if we're being real, I think turn 2 Agent Venom is probably a little better than turn 2 Scream. And you really need to make them confused. You need to, like, really leverage the fact that you can mess up their game plans and their planning, and that is how you win with this deck against those decks that would otherwise outpower you. You will be shocked to know that the AV Iron Man deck is still good. It is performing a little bit worse than it was before the Shadow King buff, and I think perhaps a lot of that is down to the fact that, even though you are a Cosmo deck, it's not like you're invulnerable to Shadow King, and there are a lot more decks looking to use Shadow King right now. AV Sera is being played a ton more. That's not a great matchup for you. They are, of course, a Shadow King, Rogue, US Agent, Agent Venom deck. Like, that's a lot of cards that are good against you. That's a whole lot of cards that are good against you. And so this deck is not necessarily losing ground in terms of actual power output. It's losing ground in terms of like what other people are doing. I think more people are playing AV Sera since the patch than played AV Sera at all, basically. AV Sera is exploding in popularity right now for good reason. I believe it's the highest win rate deck on Untapped in top 10% with more than 200 games played. There's a good reason for that, and that is that it's very good into the other Agent Venom decks. And this is one of those other Agent Venom decks that it is very good into. Now, this is still a very powerful and strong deck, but also people are just so much more used to what it does. There's not really a lot of variation in these lists. Sometimes there's an Ant-Man in here, but mostly your opponent is able to very much math out what you're doing. And that means that a lot of your final turns come down to reads, come down to 50-50s, and that's, fine. That's not the end of the world, but it's definitely not the dominating performance that this deck was putting up last week. Revis put together a Supergiant Ajax deck that honestly I feel like is one of the strongest decks in the game right now. The surprise factor with this deck is so massive. It is quite difficult to play, but there is so much upside to learning how to play this deck right now. Being a Luke Cage deck is really good. Not only are plenty of other people playing US Agent, but plenty of other people are also playing Man-Thing. B, you get to play US Agent and Man-Thing and feel great about it. C, you can use Supergiant Daredevil for massive information asymmetry. And D, you still have all the power of a normal Ajax deck. And I think that's the real thing that this deck is doing right now. It might look a little weird, but make no mistake, this is still a big boy Ajax deck. It's just got some other accoutrement attached now. Ajax has been a phenomenal card since his release. Not necessarily a foundational card in the metagame, but much like life, Ajax keeps managing to find a way. I don't think I've done a tier list without him on it in a very long time. He's not always the best deck in the game, the second or third best deck in the game, but he's always in contention, and a lot of that is just down to the fact that he is extremely large and goes with a very powerful package. US Agent is extremely relevant against a wide variety of decks. Man-Thing is completely excellent against Bounce, against all the AV decks. They're all playing small stuff. You love having a Man-Thing. And so that allows the package that goes with Ajax, Hazmat, Luke Cage, Man-Thing, US Agent. We all know what that package is, and that package has been in and out of a bunch of different decks. Ajax is obviously core to it, and this is an Ajax deck that has a bunch of unique twists on it. Supergiant enables so much incredible stuff. You get to snipe stuff with Echo, you get to snipe stuff with Negasonic, you get to snipe stuff with Cosmo. Managing priority is actually difficult, figuring out, do I want priority here? What's actually going to happen? But Daredevil's Supergiant is genuinely as strong as, it's not the strongest play in the game, but it's really up there. It's a dangerous, dangerous play. The one warning I will give you is if you're playing Hydra Bob in this deck, which I do recommend, he is a 1/5. You really need points. You care about priority a lot and your ability to manipulate it, as well as your ability to get in closed off locations, is pretty limited to Hydra Bob. That said, do keep in mind that your snap is a resource when you play this deck. It is a resource and you have to treat it as such. Here's what Arishem has been doing, and Arishem's having basically a little bit of a better time of it than it did last metagame. A lot of why Arishem was so down bad last metagame was there was a big amount of Cassandra Nova because the most played deck was AV Iron Man, which played Cassandra Nova. And then there was also 10% of the metagame that was playing Darkhawk Rock Slide type stuff, which just got nerfed. And so far, I haven't played anything that feels like it recaptures the magic. There's some promising decks looking like they might be okay on Untapped. When I tried them, I did not get anywhere with them, and so they're not on this tier list. But I think the major point I'm making is there's a lot less people playing that deck. And there's a lot less people playing AV Iron Man because everyone is playing the other AV decks, whether that be because Toxin just came out or because Sera has a pretty good matchup into it. So the overall concentration of Darkhawk and Cassandra Nova, which is something that matters a lot to Arishem, has decreased in a notable way. This, of course, does mean that Arishem is able to succeed a little bit more. But what I can't figure out is whether that's because of this Storm inclusion, the sort of lockdown stuff that this Arishem deck is doing, or just because of the metagame trends. The deck definitely is doing better and does feel stronger, but I'm not sure if that's because this build is better and is a genuine improvement over the previous, or because less people are playing the cards that instantly lose you the game. If you're sick of your opponents doing things, the best way to stop them from doing things is Cosmo, Madam Web, and Alioth. This deck is just a nightmare to play against. It is one of the hardest things in the game right now to play against a Madam Web Cosmo that can be backed up with Alioth. Like, it's just, I cannot stress enough how horrifying it is to play against that, because you end up having fundamentally no idea whether your cards will have text on the final turn of the game unless they get through at least one of those two cards. This makes calculating final turns an absolute headache, and that is not even to say anything about the fact that this is also a Heimdall deck. This is, in my humble opinion, both the hardest deck to play and the hardest deck to play against in the entire game. I realize that there are decks that people may consider harder because they haven't sort of built up the muscles to understand those decks. Supergiant is one, but once you've played a decent amount of Supergiant, it's actually not that complicated. This deck is never not complicated. It's always 50-50s. It's always guesswork, and it's always impossible to play against. This is a strong, strong deck with a lot of relevant power, but also a lot of ability to totally brick. And that is really the thing that keeps this deck balanced, is that some of the time when you queue this deck up, you're just going to draw cards that do nothing. You're going to get all the cards that say move another card and none of the cards that want to be moved. And then your Alioth plan looks incredibly stupid because you're never ahead, because you're not actually putting points on the board because you didn't draw Vulture, you didn't draw Dagger, you didn't draw Human Torch. But in those games where your hands actually work out, the deck is borderline unbeatable. The amount of interaction it can turn off is absolutely unbelievably high. And that is a very relevant thing in a world where people are playing Sera tech and people are playing bounce decks. Like, if you want to get rid of that stuff, you can get rid of that stuff. Small Ball Move is also on here. I think this deck is sort of similar to the previous one, but markedly easier to play. And I think you can also try to get Havoc in here. When I checked the stats, the version with Toxin instead of Havoc had much higher stats than just literally just that one card swap out made Toxin a little bit better. But I'm not sure that's necessarily proof of anything so much as it is an example of, just how this deck has to be approached. I think Havoc is actually a pretty solid inclusion as well if you did buy Toxin, but I have enjoyed playing Toxin in here. She's just a big guy. Toxin's he's just a big guy. And this deck is mostly about putting points on the board and playing the aggro game. You want to be aggressive, you want to get priority, you want to Cosmo their interaction on you, and then you want to play a bunch of cards on the final turn of the game. You want to put as much power on the board as you can, and that's kind of your job, honestly. Your job is get ahead, put points on the board, and then boom, you Cosmo their interaction. You go like Cosmo and then like Dagger, Ghost Spider, and it's like 14 points in one lane, a Cosmo in another, and that's just kind of what this deck does. It's strong as hell. Discard is still discard. It is taking a little bit of a beating in the context of people playing more Supergiant, but I actually think that matchup is not as good for the Supergiant player as you might think. Yes, it stops MODOK, but also, does it actually? Like, the discard deck just gets to outscale a lot of the smaller mid-range decks, and whether or not you like it, I think Supergiant does fall into that category. Even in the world where you stop them from playing MODOK on 5. You might get them with that once, but long term, I think once people get used to that play pattern, the matchup ends up going back in favor of the discard player. This deck is a deck that is a stats check as well, similar to Bounce, but it is a little more finicky in terms of when it is effectively able to stat check people. The good draws with this deck are honestly amazing. It's very hard to beat a good draw with this deck, especially if your opponent is not drawing very well. The bad draws with this deck are borderline unplayable. And that is a really big issue for the archetype, because a lot of your good draws are going to really be competitive with almost everything in the metagame, and then your bad draws are you're going to be you limping around and then probably retreating when they snap. And there have been decks like that before. I honestly would compare this to like where Destroy was back when Destroy was like still kind of playable, as opposed to like now. It's a similar dynamic of like stat checking, where yes, they can go over the top of you, and yes, you are a little bit clunky, but when you really pop off, it's very hard to beat you. And the difference is just that Discard is vulnerable to a lot less tech than Destroy is. Like, the decks are fairly similar in essence, but fundamentally, this deck loses to way less tech cards than Destroy does, and that allows it to exist in a more free state in the current metagame. Now, you'll notice that I just swapped Collector out for Meek. I know this might be hard to believe, but sometimes I make mistakes too. I recorded this while having a Collector list up there instead of Meek. If you don't have Meek, Collector is absolutely fine, but Meek is a better option at this point. I realize there are going to be people who look at me crazy with this one, but this deck is actually pretty damn good. Yes, it is Dracula Dump, but there are two cards that make this a lot harder for your opponents to deal with. First one is Black Swan. What a great way to get all of the cards out of my hand is they're free. Second one is, of course, War Machine. So this is a deck that now has access to, whether or not there's a Dracula on the board, there are incredible nut draws in this deck. You can have a bunch of free 1-drops and a Afflictfinaut. That is what your turn 6 can be. You're not really doing a lot before that, but you also don't need to. And the major advantage of a strategy like this that is hand dumping on the final turn of the game is that it can choose better where to invest. The nut draw here, of course, is you have a strong guy on the board, you have a Dracula on the board, you have both of the big guys in hand, you have a Black Swan on the board, you final turn dump everything, one big guy comes down, that's the Red Hulk, then the Dracula always hits the Afflictfinaut, you absolutely go crazy, right? There are some wrinkles here, like obviously not every game is going to be like that, but the output of power here is actually quite good, and there is something to be said for being a similar deck to Bounce in terms of point output, but one that people are far less prepared to actually deal with. Cards like Eliath and cards like Cosmo are not nearly so good against you as they are against your cousin, the Bounce deck. And so that enables you to be a real threat in this metagame. You have a real niche where the Bounce deck probably or reasonably can outpoint you, but won't always. You are much less vulnerable to Cosmo, to Eliath, to things of that nature. And that matters. Every week, I talk to my friends about what decks they're winning with and sort of weigh whether or not we should put them on the tier list based on like how much I believe that it's them or how much that I believe that it's the deck. This tier list is going to be a little bit of an exception because basically when I talked to all of my friends, I was like, you know what? This time, I'm going to trust you. If you say a deck is good, it will go on here. And granted, when I say my friends, I'm not just putting random people's decks on here. Every single one of the people you'll see cited as a deck list here is somewhere between rank 25 and rank 1. So we're talking about several of the best players in the game. These are the decks that they're playing. This one comes from Big Baby. It is a powerful mid-range interactive deck, and like many decks that good players succeed with, it leverages confusion and the lack of understanding of what your opponent is actually trying to do in order to get to a mid-range deck that has a lot of answers for a lot of stuff, but also is very difficult to play against if you don't know what that stuff is. The Misery Black Widow path is a really reasonable one in this list. Like, having that ability in your deck alongside a very powerful mid-range core. I mean, we just saw the Darkhawk deck do effectively this, and this is sort of a spiritual successor. It's less invested in it, but it does just have that nut draw, right? And it is a deck that can absolutely afford to run both of those cards. And because it can afford to run both of those cards, sometimes you draw both of those cards, and then it's really hard to lose when you do that because your opponent is drawing two cards that aren't cards. And that kind of stuff, like this just like mid-range attacking from a weird angle, that's the stuff that good players do really well. And I want people who are listening to this to actually take note because this is a really clever way to attack a metagame. It's taking something that we know is good, the Black Widow misery stuff, and saying, let's not be locked into the old ways of thinking about this. Let's actually go for it and let's play some really strong stuff in ways our opponents are not going to be expecting. For those who are unfamiliar with Derek, he's currently rank 1 in the world. This is his weekly pile submission. Every week he sends me a new mid-range pile that I can only assume he wins with because he's either really good or because his opponents have no idea what the gag is in each of them. And I think there is a lot of that to this, where it's like, if you don't know what's happening to you, there's going to be a bunch of awful snaps that just absolutely scam the crap out of you. Quake stuff, Quake Storm, like just a bunch of horrific, heinous stuff that can really beat you up. And it also does require a lot from you. But like fundamentally what this deck is 12 really good cards that are hard to understand when you're playing against them. And you're just going to be like, what the hell? He was playing that when you lose to this? And that is, again, we talk about deck building at the top level. A lot of it is being unpredictable. There is a non-zero amount of equity lost from me being a streamer and having all my decks go everywhere. And I worry that for Derek, me putting this list on the tier list will actually cost him equity with this list. There is a genuine worry that I have where it's like, okay, man, I'm pretty sure putting this list on the tier list will make you have a lower win rate and a lower cube rate because people will now be aware of whatever weird garbage you're trying to do. The next time you're snapping into I'm ahead and Storm Legion, it might not work because they might know that's what's happening. And that's a really scary thing to think about, right? This deck is similar in concept to the Dracula Dump decks, but instead of investing in 6-drops and things like that, it's investing in the world's largest bounce cards you can imagine. It's a similar play style to Dracula Dump, but instead of like a 20 power Infinaut, you're looking at like a 96 power Human Torch on a Sinister London. No, I'm not mad. I definitely didn't lose to exactly that play out of this deck from the person who made it, Splat. Definitely didn't happen. I definitely didn't lose to a 96 power Human Torch. That was not a thing that happened to me. Anyway, that's pretty much what you want to do with this deck. Not that I would know what it's like to have it happen to you, but that's the goal here, is just you have a similar approach to the other like Explode on turn 6 decks, but your goal is basically to do it in a way that is, you know, confusing and weird and hard to manage. And you have this ability to actually beat out Cosmo in ways that are not always incredible, but a card like Aranya will work through Cosmo. You have this ability to have a bunch of stats on the board. Your cards don't really cost anything because of Black Widow. You have a giant hit bunkie. You have a giant strong guy. You have the ability to do double Gwenpool. The deck does stuff. I'm not going to sit here and tell you the deck doesn't do stuff. And I think it's instructive that this is the other form of like, what are my good friends playing deck? It is this, there are two forms. One is like mid-range pile, and the other is like turn 6 pile, where we have like other mid-range decks in the format, right? And that's what's competing with the mid-range piles. And we have other turn 6 decks in the format, and that's what's competing with the turn 6 piles. But that's pretty much the shape of like, if you want to be, you know, if you want to explore ideas, you're going to want to do so within the confines of those right now. Hey, remember when I said a lot of these decks are either turn 6 decks or mid-range piles? Check it out. Here's another turn 6 deck. This one, of course, courtesy of KX4N. I honestly a little bit at a loss for words. Do I need to talk about the intricacies of Moon Girl combo? Is that really what I need to talk about right now? Because it feels pretty straightforward to me. Your goal is to copy She-Hulks and then play a bunch of them. That's what you're doing. You're trying to copy She-Hulks. You're trying to make them bigger if you can. Use your Hope Summers to make that happen. But like, fundamentally, this deck is like pretty straightforward in terms of what it's actually trying to do. It is yet another turn 6 Black Swan deck. Like, we're really seeing some stuff that's like coming up and coming up and coming up and coming up. Seeing a lot of things that are doing a lot of stuff. And the themes are being iterated upon repeatedly, so I don't want to stress on this one too much. I don't want to harp on this one too much. I'm pretty sure you guys understand how to play a turn 6 deck like this. BBAK, a Korean player that I have a lot of respect for, cooked this up in order to deal with some of the stuff the metagame is doing. Obviously, Mobius has a lot of utility against those turn 6 decks. The issue this deck runs into is, unless you're really drawing well, it doesn't match up on power. Like, you have the stuff you need to beat these decks. But also, you need to actually get it. And if you don't get it, your deck is just like sitting there twiddling its thumbs. Wiccan decks are not a big part of the metagame for a reason. And that reason, unfortunately, is that a lot of stuff outpowers them. And even if you drag these decks down to your level, even if you are able to do this, you still kind of need to be comboing off. You need a lot of nut draws to keep up with stuff in this deck. That was my experience, at least. It can win. I did okay with it. And then it can lose. I also did pretty bad with it afterwards. This is a deck that lives and dies by what it's able to output and what the matchups are. It's quite good if you are able to actually use stuff like Mobius Sandman to disrupt your opponent. The issue you run into is that this is not as common as you think. And if that is your only way of winning a matchup, you might think it makes you favored, but if you need to do specific stuff to be in the matchup, that actually doesn't make you favored. Like, that's actually kind of an issue. You are playing this very specific tech to take a deck with a relatively lower point ceiling and put it among the decks that are able to outpoint it. If you don't draw it, you're getting run over anyway. And so when you're in a situation where you have to draw this in order for there to be a game, that's not something that I'm often happy with. Despite the fact that, yes, when you draw it, a lot of the time you win. If you don't draw it, you are always losing. And that's a really bad spot. This is a Tommy/EK Monty Cook, and the basic theory here is I would like to put points on the board. Again, you know, like we talk about this, it's either mid-range decks or turn 6 decks. This one's kind of both, but like realistically, it's mostly like just like, hey, let's play cards, let's put guys on the board, let's play Black Knight, let's get a 20 power dude. I actually think it's like a little bit risky to be a Black Knight deck right now. Like, the card Shadow King has never been stronger, literally never. And the Black Knight's Ebony Blade actually does get massively Shadow Kinged, but I will say that the ability of cards like Sera in here to allow that to be a turn 6 output play, like you have the ability to like turn 6 Ebony Blade Ghost Rider, and you kind of need that if you want to be dealing with Shadow King. Now, another card that's actually quite good right now is Luke Cage. This deck just gets to have that, but this is kind of a feast or famine deck. If you're not, you know, doing the thing, the deck is very much twiddling its thumbs. You do get Luke Cage Valentina, which is not a bad interaction to have in your back pocket, but it is still a bit of a thumb twiddler in the face of a lot of the stuff you're going to see. If you want to play Silver Surfer, I guess my fundamental contention is that you probably shouldn't. And I'm putting this list on here to demonstrate other directions that the list can go, because right now Silver Surfer is in a bind. It's not really a deck that can compete with AV decks on points. It's not a deck that can get priority well enough to use Cosmo. And it's not a deck that has any way to make sure it doesn't get massively Shadow Kinged. And so this deck is a points deck, but the interaction isn't very good right now. And because of that, it just ends up not really having a home. I've seen some interesting stuff with AV. I'm not saying this is 100% better than your traditional version of the deck, but I do like that it mixes things up in a meaningful way and gives you the ability to compete on points with decks that you would otherwise be unable to compete on points with. That means that you can really surprise people who are not playing around your Iron Man. That's what it means. And that is what you're going to have to leverage if you want to play a deck like Surfer right now. And I think a lot of what I said about Surfer holds true for Destroy, which is not on this tier list because there's basically no Destroy deck with more than a 51% win rate at top 10% infinite in more than 100 games. And there's a bunch that are below that. And a bunch, like there are more Destroy decks below 50% win rate than there are above. And I just feel like once you hit that threshold, I can't realistically recommend it. Whereas I have seen people playing this deck, its stats look okay, and it represents a meaningful future for the archetype where Destroy is just, it's the same thing it's always been, but Agony is in it sometimes now. Finally, we've got Zoo. I'm not really of the opinion that this deck is amazing, but it's still a strong enough deck. I think one of the things that people always miss about Zoo is that, you know, yes, you can get massively invisible when Killmongered. Yes, it's not at the top tier. Yes. But there is so much to be said for a deck that just does points well and consistently. And that doesn't mean that this is a great, amazing deck, but what it does mean is that you do stuff so reliably and regularly that it's very difficult for a deck that is clunking to actually keep up, because your clunks are usually better than their clunks. If both of you are drawing pretty bad, you're probably going to win. And that sort of floor is what keeps Zoo around, and what, like, that exact dynamic, like Zoo having a floor of like, oh man, my opponent just didn't Agent Venom me and I can actually compete on points now. That's real. Whereas a Destroy deck, it's more dependent on what you do. With a Zoo deck, it's like, you know, if your opponent is not doing crazy stuff, you can beat them, and you probably will. There are a couple of major things you're going to want to watch out for. There are a lot of rogues in the metagame right now. There are a lot of Cosmos in the metagame right now. You have the ability to interact with this kind of stuff with Echo. That is in this deck right now. I'm not saying it's an amazing choice, but I am saying that I would like to have the ability to deal with that Iron Man, to deal with that Cosmo, to deal with that stuff. And Echo does let us do this while also synergizing with our one-drop game plan. All right, y'all, thank you so much. As always, I have been KM Please remember to like and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed the KM Boost, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks so much.